The gunshot that rang out across the prairie that September morning in 1882 changed everything, though Clara Zimmerman wouldn't understand why until the sun had set and risen again. She'd been collecting eggs from the henhouse behind her family's ranch when she heard it, the sharp crack echoing across the Wyoming grasslands that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Her basket slipped from her fingers, eggs cracking against the dusty ground as she ran toward the sound, her boots kicking up small clouds with each frantic step. 23 years she'd lived on this land, and she knew the difference between a hunter's rifle and trouble. Austin Lawrence was already riding hard toward the Zimmerman property when Clara emerged from behind the barn, her dark hair coming loose from its braid, her calico dress dusty at the hem. He pulled his horse up short, the animal's hooves skidding in the dirt, and for a moment they just stared at each other the way they'd been doing their whole lives, with words caught somewhere between their hearts and their mouths. "Stay back," Austin called out, swinging down from his saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd been born on horseback. At 25, he'd grown into the kind of man that made women in town whisper behind their hands at church socials, all broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin, with eyes the color of creek water in summer. But he'd never looked at anyone the way he looked at Clara, even if he'd spent 2 decades pretending otherwise. "That came from the north pasture," Clara said, already moving past him. "That's where Papa was checking the fence line." Austin caught her arm, his calloused fingers gentle despite their strength. "Then let me go first." They found Jonathan Zimmerman sitting against a fence post, his leg bleeding but his rifle across his lap and a dead rattlesnake several feet away. The relief that flooded through Clara made her knees weak, but Austin was already there, kneeling in the grass, examining the wound with practiced efficiency. "Shot the damn thing before it could strike," Jonathan said through gritted teeth, his weathered face pale beneath his tan. "But I fell wrong, twisted my leg bad. Think it might be broken." "We need to get you back to the house," Austin said, already calculating angles and distance. "Clara, ride back and get the wagon ready. I'll stay with him." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to be the one who stayed, but she'd learned long ago that Austin Lawrence didn't give orders lightly. She ran for her horse, mounted without bothering with the saddle, and rode like the wind itself was chasing her. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of activity. Doc Henderson came from town, set the leg, and pronounced that Jonathan would need to stay off it for at least 6 weeks. Martha Zimmerman, Clara's mother, took the news with the quiet strength of a woman who'd survived 2 hard winters and a prairie fire, but Clara saw the worry lines deepen around her eyes. 6 weeks during the busiest time of year, with cattle to move and fences to mend, and 1,000 other tasks that kept a ranch running. "I'll handle it," Austin said, standing in their parlor with his hat in his hands, speaking directly to Jonathan, who was laid up on the settee with his legs splinted and propped. "My place can spare me for a while. Got good hands working for me, who can manage without me breathing down their necks every minute." "Austin, you can't just abandon your own ranch," Jonathan protested, but there was hope in his voice, the desperate hope of a man who'd spent his whole life working his land and couldn't bear to see it fall to neglect. "Not abandoning anything," Austin replied. "Just helping out my neighbors. The way your family helped mine when my father died. The way Clara's been helping my sister with her reading every Sunday after church. We take care of our own out here." Clara stood in the doorway, watching the exchange, feeling something shift in her chest. She'd known Austin Lawrence since before either of them could walk, had grown up running through the tall grass with him, learning to ride horses in the same dusty corral, sitting beside him in the one-room schoolhouse that served the scattered ranches around Laramie. She'd watched him grow from a boy who put frogs in her lunch pail to a man who'd built his own ranch from nothing after his father's death 5 years ago. She'd watched him court Sarah Jane Miller 2 years back, had felt something dark and ugly twist in her stomach when she'd seen them together at the harvest dance, had told herself it was just indigestion from Mrs. Peterson's potato salad. When Sarah Jane had broken things off to marry a banker from Cheyenne, Clara had found Austin sitting by the creek that ran between their properties, staring at the water. She'd sat down beside him without a word, and they'd stayed there until the stars came out, not talking, just being. That was the thing about Austin, she realized. She didn't need to fill the silence with him. The silence was enough. Now he was standing in her parlor, volunteering to put his own work aside to save her family's ranch, and she couldn't quite catch her breath. The next morning, Austin arrived as the sun was painting the sky pink and gold, riding up with his bedroll and saddlebags packed. "Figure it makes more sense to stay in the bunkhouse," he explained to Martha, who'd already started cooking enough breakfast to feed a cattle crew. "That way I can get an early start each day, make the most of the daylight." So Austin Lawrence moved into the Zimmerman ranch, and Clara's carefully ordered world tilted sideways. She'd see him at breakfast, sitting at their table with his hair damp from washing at the pump, laughing at something her younger brother Thomas said. She'd watch him work from the kitchen window as she helped her mother with the endless cooking and cleaning. See him stripped down to his undershirt in the afternoon heat, muscles moving beneath sun-darkened skin as he repaired fence posts. She'd find him in the barn at evening, brushing down the horses, singing some old trail song under his breath in a voice that made her think of whiskey and campfire smoke. "You're staring," her mother said one afternoon, catching Clara frozen at the window with a half-peeled potato in her hands. "I'm just making sure he's not overdoing it," Clara replied quickly, but her cheeks burned. Martha smiled, the knowing smile of a woman who'd been young once herself. "That boy has been sweet on you since you were both knee-high to a grasshopper." "Mama, that's ridiculous. Austin and I are just friends. We've always been just friends." "If you say so, dear," Martha said, but her smile didn't fade. Clara tried to push the conversation from her mind, but it lodged there like a burr. She found herself remembering things she'd carefully not thought about for years. The way Austin had punched Billy Crawford when they were 12 because Billy had pulled her hair and made her cry. The way he'd taught her to shoot when she was 15, standing behind her with his arms around hers, guiding her aim, his breath warm against her ear. The way he'd looked at her at the summer dance last year, right before Thomas Miller had asked her to dance, and how Austin had left early, and she'd felt the whole evening go flat like day-old beer. A week into Austin's stay, a storm rolled in from the mountains, one of those early autumn tempests that turned the sky black and sent rain down in sheets. Clara was in the barn trying to calm the horses when Austin came running in, soaked through, his shirt plastered to his body. "We need to get the cattle in from the east pasture," he shouted over the thunder. "This keeps up, the creek's going to flood." "I'll help," Clara said immediately, already moving toward her horse. "Like hell you will," Austin said, then caught himself. "Sorry, I mean it's too dangerous." "It's my family's cattle," Clara shot back, her temper flaring the way it always did when someone tried to protect her from her own life. "I've been riding these pastures since before I could read. I know every gully and wash between here and town." They stared at each other, both stubborn, both refusing to back down. Finally, Austin shook his head, water dripping from his hair. "Fine, but you stay close to me, and if I say we turn back, we turn back." They rode out into the storm together, and it was like riding through a wall of water. The rain came down so hard Clara could barely see her horse's ears, and the thunder was a physical thing that she felt in her chest. But she knew this land, knew it in her bones, and she guided them toward the east pasture where the cattle would be bunched up and frightened. They found the herd and started pushing them toward higher ground, working in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's movements the way only people who'd known each other forever could. The creek was already rising, muddy water churning and fast, and Clara's heart was pounding as they drove the last of the cattle away from the bank. She didn't see the washout until her horse was already stumbling, the ground giving way beneath his hooves. She felt herself falling, felt the horse falling with her, and then Austin was there, somehow already off his horse and grabbing for her. He pulled her clear as her horse scrambled up the bank, and they both went down in the mud, rolling until they were tangled together on solid ground, both breathing hard, rain streaming down their faces. "You could have been killed," Austin said, and his voice was raw in a way she'd never heard before. "But I wasn't," Clara gasped. "You got me." "I always will," he said, and there was something in his eyes, something fierce and desperate that made her heart stop. "Don't you know that by now? I'd ride into hell itself for you, Clara Zimmerman." The rain pounded down around them, and Clara couldn't tell if the water on her face was rain or tears. "Austin," she whispered, but she didn't know what else to say, how to put words to the feeling that was building in her chest like a storm of its own. He pulled away, helped her to her feet, and they rode back to the ranch in silence. But something had changed. Some line had been crossed, and Clara lay awake that night in her bed listening to the rain on the roof and wondering what happened next. The next few weeks passed in a strange, charged atmosphere. Austin was unfailingly polite, helpful, present. He fixed the barn door that had been sticking for months. He helped Thomas with his arithmetic homework in the evenings. He brought Martha wildflowers he'd found while riding the fence line, making her blush like a girl. But he barely looked at Clara, and when he did, his expression was carefully neutral. It was driving her mad. She found herself picking fights over nothing, criticizing the way he'd stacked the firewood, arguing about which pasture the horses should graze in. He took it all with maddening calm, agreeing with her, deferring to her judgment, being so reasonable she wanted to scream. "What's gotten into you?" her mother finally asked after Clara had snapped at Austin over breakfast for the third morning in a row. "Nothing," Clara said, but even she didn't believe it. Jonathan's leg was healing well, and they all knew Austin would be going back to his own ranch soon. The thought made Clara feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into nothing. She couldn't let him leave. She couldn't stand another day of this careful distance. But she didn't know how to bridge the gap between them, didn't know how to tell him that she'd been lying to herself for years about what he meant to her. The answer came in the form of a letter from Sarah Jane Miller, now Sarah Jane Harrison, that arrived on a Tuesday morning. Austin was in town picking up supplies when the mail came, and Clara signed for his letter along with her family's mail without thinking. She wouldn't have read it, would have just handed it over, except that as she was setting it on the hall table, it slipped from the stack and fell open. She only saw one line, but it was enough. "I was a fool to let you go, and if you've not found someone else, I hope you'll consider giving me another chance now that my circumstances have changed." Clara sat down hard on the stairs, the letter shaking in her hands. Sarah Jane wanted him back. Of course she did. What woman wouldn't want Austin Lawrence, with his kind heart and strong hands and that smile that made something warm bloom in your chest? And Austin had loved Sarah Jane, had courted her properly, had probably been planning to marry her before she'd chosen money over love. "Clara, what's wrong?" Martha came into the hall, took one look at her daughter's face, and sat down beside her. She plucked the letter from Clara's nerveless fingers, read it, and sighed. "Oh, honey, he'll go back to her," Clara said, and her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Why wouldn't he? She's beautiful and refined, and she didn't spend the first 12 years of their acquaintance putting frogs in his lunch pail." "Is that what you think?" Martha asked gently. "That Austin Lawrence has spent the last month working himself to the bone for your father, staying for dinner every night, finding excuses to be near you, all because he's pining for Sarah Jane Harrison. He doesn't find excuses to be near me. He barely talks to me anymore." "Because you're so welcoming when he does." Clara looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw the affectionate exasperation there. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be the kind of girl men court. I can rope a calf and shoot a rifle and ride all day without complaining, but I don't know how to flutter my eyelashes or say clever things or make him see me as anything other than his childhood friend." "Clara Ruth Zimmerman," Martha said firmly, "that man sees you just fine. He's been seeing you your whole life. The question is whether you're brave enough to let him know you see him too." Austin came back from town in the late afternoon, and Clara was waiting for him in the barn where he'd been staying, Sarah Jane's letter in her pocket. Her heart was beating so hard she thought he'd be able to hear it, but she made herself stand still as he walked in, his arms full of supply boxes. "Clara," he said, surprised. "Something wrong?" "Your letter came," she said, pulling it out and holding it toward him. "From Sarah Jane." Something shuddered in his expression as he set down the boxes and took the letter. He didn't open it, just turned it over in his hands. "Did you read it?" "Part of it fell open. I saw enough." She took a breath, made herself brave. "Are you going to go back to her?" Austin was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked over to the small stove in the corner of the bunkhouse, opened the door, and threw the letter in without reading the rest. They both watched it catch fire and curl into ash. "That answer your question?" he said softly. "Why?" Clara asked. "She's everything a man could want. She's not you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. "Austin." He turned to look at her, and there was no distance in his expression now, no careful neutrality. There was heat and longing and something that looked like pain. "Do you know what torture it's been staying here?" he asked. "Seeing you every day, sitting across from you at meals, watching you move through your life. Being so close to you and not being able to touch you, tell you what you mean to me." "Then why didn't you?" she demanded, moving closer. "Why did you pull away after the storm?" "Because I'm a coward," he said flatly. "Because I've loved you since we were kids, and I never said anything because I was afraid of ruining our friendship. Then I tried to convince myself I could love someone else, and that was a disaster because all I did was compare Sarah Jane to you and find her wanting. And when I pulled you out of that washout, I knew I couldn't keep pretending anymore, but I also knew that if I said something and you didn't feel the same way, it would break me." Clara was standing right in front of him now, so close she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could smell the scent of him, leather and sage and something uniquely Austin. "You really are an idiot, Austin Lawrence," she said, but her voice was shaking. "If you'd bothered to ask, I could have told you that I've been in love with you since I was 16 years old and you gave me your jacket at the autumn dance because I was cold." "You," Austin said slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You love me." "I love you so much it makes me crazy," Clara said. "I love the way you sing to the horses and the way you make my mother laugh and the way you're patient with Thomas. I love that you dropped everything to help my family without being asked. I love that you've been my best friend for as long as I can remember, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." Austin reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he cupped her face. "Clara," he breathed, "I've wasted so much time." "Then stop wasting it," she said. He kissed her. Finally, after all the years of wondering and wanting and telling herself it would never happen, Austin Lawrence kissed her. His lips were warm and gentle at first, questioning, and then when she made a soft sound and pressed closer, the kiss deepened into something that made her knees weak. His arms came around her, pulling her against him, and she wound her hands into his hair and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Austin rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done this years ago," he said roughly. "Should have told you, should have fought for you, should have stopped being such a coward." "You're telling me now," Clara said, smiling through the tears on her cheeks. "That's what matters." "Marry me," Austin said suddenly, urgently. "I know that's fast, I know we should probably court properly, but Clara, I've already wasted so much time. I don't want to waste another day. Marry me." "Yes," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Austin, of course yes." He kissed her again, and it was like coming home to a place she hadn't known she'd been searching for. When they finally made their way back to the main house, hand in hand, Martha took one look at their faces and called for Jonathan and Thomas to come quick. There was celebrating to be done. They were married 6 weeks later, on a crisp November day when the aspens had turned gold on the mountainsides and the air smelled of coming snow. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Austin had ridden out at dawn to pick for her. They spoke their vows in the small church in Laramie, with what seemed like half the county in attendance, and when the preacher said Austin could kiss his bride, he did so with such enthusiasm that people laughed and cheered. The reception was held at the Zimmerman ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed an army. People danced to fiddle music as the sun set, and Clara danced with her new husband under the stars, feeling like she might burst from happiness. "What are you thinking?" Austin asked as they swayed together, his arms tight around her. "That I'm the luckiest woman alive," Clara said, "and that I can't believe we were both so stupid for so long." "We weren't stupid," Austin said. "We were just waiting for the right time." "And nearly dying in a storm was the right time." "Maybe it was," he said seriously. "Maybe that was when I finally understood that I'd rather have one moment of truth with you than a lifetime of pretending with anyone else." They spent their wedding night in Austin's ranch house, the place he'd built with his own hands, and Clara felt strange and wonderful claiming her place in his home. He carried her over the threshold even though she protested. She was perfectly capable of walking. And then he kissed her in the doorway and carried her all the way to the bedroom, and Clara stopped protesting altogether. In the morning, she woke up in Austin's arms, sunlight streaming through the window, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening. This was her life now. This man, this home, this future they'd build together. They combined their ranches, running them as one operation, and proved to be even better partners in business than they were in friendship. Clara had her father's head for numbers and her mother's practical wisdom, while Austin had an instinct for horses that bordered on supernatural. Together, they built something strong and lasting. The first winter of their marriage was hard, the kind of brutal cold that killed cattle and tested resolve, but they weathered it together. Clara learned what it meant to be a true partner to someone, to share not just the good days but the difficult ones, to work side by side mending fences in the freezing wind, and know that you were building something that mattered. Spring came eventually, the way it always did, and with it came new life. The horses foaled, the cattle calved, and Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Austin on a warm May evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, and she watched his face transform from surprise to wonder to pure joy. "A baby," he said, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "We're having a baby." "We are," Clara confirmed, and then laughed as Austin let out a whoop and picked her up, spinning her around before carefully setting her back down like she was made of glass. "Sorry," he said. "Should I not have done that? Can I hurt the baby by doing that?" "The baby is fine," Clara said, taking his face in her hands. "I'm not fragile, Austin. I'm just pregnant." Their son was born in January 1884 during a snowstorm that buried the ranch in white drifts. Doc Henderson barely made it through the roads in time, and Austin paced the parlor like a caged animal while Martha and the doctor attended to Clara. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he burst into the bedroom despite Martha's protests and went straight to Clara's side. "We have a son," Clara said, exhausted and radiant, holding the tiny bundle. "Austin, we have a son." They named him James after Austin's father, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's green eyes. Austin was a natural father, patient and gentle, singing the same trail songs to his son that he'd once sung to the horses. Clara would find them together in the rocking chair by the fire, Austin reading aloud from whatever book was at hand, even though James was far too young to understand, just wanting his son to hear his voice. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Rose in 1886, and another son, Henry, in 1889. The ranch prospered, their reputation for quality horses spreading throughout Wyoming and beyond. They built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family, and Clara's parents moved into a small cottage on the property after Jonathan decided he was ready to retire from the hardest ranch work. Through it all, Clara and Austin remained each other's best friends, the way they'd always been. They still raced their horses across the prairie on early mornings, still sat by the creek talking until the stars came out, still finished each other's sentences, and communicated with glances across crowded rooms. But now there was also passion and partnership, the deep, abiding love of 2 people who'd chosen each other every single day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Austin took Clara back to the spot by the creek where they'd sat together after Sarah Jane had broken his heart. It was autumn again, the leaves turning gold, the air crisp with the promise of winter. "I wanted to bring you here," Austin said, taking both her hands in his, "because this is where I started to understand that you were the one I'd been looking for all along. I was too stupid to see it then, but I see it now. I see it every day. You're my best friend, Clara. You're my partner, my love, my whole heart. And I thank God every day that I finally found the courage to tell you." "We found each other," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "We were always meant to find each other." He kissed her there by the creek, and it was just as sweet as the first time, just as full of promise and possibility. When they rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Clara thought about how far they'd come from those 2 children running through the grass, how much had changed and how much had stayed exactly the same. Their children grew strong and healthy, learning to ride almost before they could walk, learning the value of hard work and honest dealing. James turned out to have his father's way with horses and his mother's quick mind. Rose was fearless and funny, always getting into scrapes and talking her way out of trouble. Henry was the quiet one, thoughtful and observant, the one who would sit for hours watching the world around him. In 1895, when Clara was 36 and Austin was 38, they threw a party to celebrate their 15th anniversary and the official merger of the 2 ranches into Lawrence Zimmerman Stock Company. The whole county came, including Martha and Jonathan, now grandparents many times over, their faces lined with age but their eyes still bright. There was dancing and eating and toasting, and at one point Austin stood up and called for quiet. "Most of you know that Clara and I have known each other our whole lives," he said, his arm around his wife's waist. "We grew up together, learned together, built our lives side by side. But for the longest time, I was too much of a fool to see what was right in front of me. I'm standing here today to tell all you young men out there to not make the same mistake I did. If you love someone, tell them. Don't waste years wondering and waiting and being afraid. Because I nearly lost the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too scared to speak up." "You didn't lose me," Clara said, smiling up at him. "You never could have." "Only because you were brave enough for both of us," Austin replied and kissed her while everyone cheered. As the years continued to pass, their love only deepened. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns, and the changing times that saw the Wild West slowly transforming into something more settled and civilized. The railroads brought new people and new opportunities, and their ranch adapted and grew with the changing landscape. James married at 22 to a sweet girl from town named Alina, and they built a house on the northern section of the property. Rose shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to study medicine and went east to train as a nurse, returning 3 years later with a degree and a quiet doctor husband who fit into ranch life like he'd been born to it. Henry took over the horse breeding program, proving to have an even better instinct for bloodlines than his father. Austin's hair went silver at the temples, and lines appeared at the corners of Clara's eyes, but they still rode out together on Sunday mornings, still sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun set. Their hands were more weathered now, marked by decades of hard work, but when Austin reached for Clara's hand, it fit just as perfectly as it always had. On a warm summer evening in 1910, when they were both in their 50s and the ranch was in capable hands of the next generation, Clara and Austin rode out to their spot by the creek one more time. The cottonwoods had grown tall over the years, and the water still ran clear and cold from the mountains. "You ever regret it?" Austin asked, sitting beside his wife in the grass just like they'd done 100 times before. "Wonder what your life would have been like if you'd married someone else, maybe moved to a city, had an easier life." Clara looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Austin Lawrence, have you lost your mind? Why on earth would I regret marrying my best friend and spending my life doing work I love in a place I love with a man I love more than breathing? Just checking," Austin said with a grin, the same grin that had made her heart skip when she was 16 and still made it skip now. "Besides," Clara continued, leaning her head on his shoulder, "this life was never easy, but it was ours. We built it together, and I wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not even the hard times, because they led me here, to this moment with you." "I love you, Clara," Austin said, turning to cup her face in his weathered hands. "I loved you when we were children. I loved you when we were young and stupid, and I love you now. I'll love you until I take my last breath, and probably for a good long while after that." "That's good," Clara said, her eyes bright with tears and laughter. "Because you're stuck with me, Cowboy, for this life and whatever comes after." He kissed her as the sun set over the Wyoming mountains, and it was just as perfect as every kiss they'd shared over the past 30 years. When they rode back to the ranch, their children and grandchildren were gathered on the porch, and there was a cake with candles because apparently everyone had conspired to surprise them with an early anniversary celebration. "How did you know we'd be gone?" Clara asked Rose, who was looking particularly pleased with herself. "Mama, you and Daddy ride out to the creek every summer on the same day," Rose said, laughing. "We've been planning this for months." The party went late into the night. 3 generations of family celebrating the love that had started it all. Austin and Clara danced together under the stars, their grandchildren watching with wide eyes. And Clara thought about that September morning 28 years ago when a gunshot had changed everything. She thought about the storm and the kiss in the barn and Austin throwing Sarah Jane's letter into the fire. She thought about every choice and chance and moment that had led them here. "What are you smiling about?" Austin murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. "Just thinking about how perfect this all turned out," Clara said. "How we almost missed it by being too afraid to risk our friendship, but we didn't miss it. We found our way to each other and we built this beautiful life." "We did," Austin agreed. "And I'd do it all again, Clara. Every single moment. I should have done this years before I did. Should have kissed you and told you I loved you when we were still teenagers. But maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. Maybe we needed all those years of friendship to build the foundation for everything that came after." "Maybe," Clara said. "Or maybe you were just a coward who needed a near-death experience to get your head on straight." Austin laughed, the sound rich and warm and so familiar it was like coming home. "Probably that," he admitted. "But I got there eventually, and once I did, I never looked back." They stayed on the dance floor until the musicians packed up their instruments, and the grandchildren were asleep in various chairs and laps. Then Austin took Clara's hand and led her into their house, the house they'd built and filled with life and love, and they went to bed in each other's arms the way they'd done for 30 years. The ranch continued to prosper under the combined leadership of their children. James proved to be a shrewd businessman, expanding their operations and building relationships with buyers throughout the West. Rose, despite her medical training, found herself drawn back to ranch life, and she and her doctor husband set up a small practice in town while still maintaining close ties to the family business. Henry's breeding program became renowned, and people came from as far as California to buy Lawrence Zimmerman horses. Austin and Clara stepped back gradually, letting the next generation take the reins while they enjoyed the fruits of their life's work. They traveled a little, visiting Rose when she went back east for a medical conference, seeing the ocean for the first time and marveling at its vastness. But they always came back to Wyoming, to the ranch, to the land that had shaped them. In 1915, the world was changing rapidly, and there were rumblings of war in Europe that would soon touch American shores. But on the ranch, life continued in its steady rhythm. Clara was 56 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, but her eyes were still bright and her spirit still fierce. Austin was 58, his body showing the effects of decades of hard physical labor, but his smile was still the same one that had made her heart race when she was a girl. They celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them, with a picnic by the creek. Clara had made Austin's favorite fried chicken, and he'd brought a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. They sat in the grass, older now but still comfortable in each other's presence, still able to sit in companionable silence or talk for hours depending on their mood. 33 years, Austin said wonderingly. Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. I know what you mean, Clara said, leaning against him. Sometimes I look at our grandchildren and I can't believe we created all of this. That it all started with 2 kids growing up on neighboring ranches. It started before that, Austin said. It started the moment you were born, I think. The universe putting all the pieces in place so we'd find each other. You've gotten philosophical in your old age, Clara teased. Maybe. Or maybe I just appreciate what we have more now. You know how fragile it all is, how easily it could have gone differently. But it didn't, Clara said firmly. We found each other. We chose each other. And we built something that will last long after we're gone. They sat by the creek until the stars came out, the same stars that had watched over them their whole lives. When they finally headed back to the ranch, Austin helped Clara onto her horse even though she didn't need the help, and they rode home side by side, their shadows long in the moonlight. The years continued to roll forward, bringing both joy and sorrow as life always does. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1918, and Jonathan followed her 6 months later, as if he couldn't bear to be separated from his wife of 50 years. Clara mourned them deeply, but took comfort in the knowledge that they'd lived full, happy lives and had seen their family flourish. More grandchildren came, and then great-grandchildren, until family gatherings required multiple tables and careful planning. The ranch adapted to new technologies, tractors replacing some of the horse-drawn equipment, telephone lines connecting them to town. But the core of it remained the same, the land and the work and the family that sustained it all. In 1925, Austin and Clara celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a party that became legendary in local history. People came from 3 states, and there was dancing and music and food for days. Austin gave a speech that made everyone cry, talking about how Clara had been the beat of his heart for longer than he could remember, how she'd been his best friend and his great love, and the foundation of everything good in his life. "I was a fool for taking so long to tell her," he said, his voice strong despite his 68 years. "But once I finally got the courage to kiss her and tell her how I felt, my real life began. Everything before that was just waiting. So here's my advice to all of you: don't wait. If you love someone, tell them. Life's too short for fear and hesitation. Take the leap. I promise you it's worth it." Clara stood beside him, her hand in his, and she smiled through her tears. At 66, she was still beautiful, still fierce, still the woman who'd ridden into a storm to save her family's cattle. Still the girl who'd put frogs in his lunch pail and learned to shoot by his side. Still his best friend, his heart, his home. They danced that night until their children insisted they sit down and rest, and then they sat together on the porch and watched their family celebrate, watched the life they'd built continue to grow and flourish. "We did good," Austin said softly. "We did better than good," Clara replied. "We did amazing." As the decade turned and they moved into the 1930s, age began to slow them down in ways they couldn't ignore. Austin's joints ached in the winter, and Clara's eyes weren't as sharp as they'd once been. But they still rose early, still shared coffee on the porch watching the sunrise, still found reasons to laugh every single day. In 1935, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when they'd married 50 years earlier, the family gathered once more to celebrate their golden anniversary. All 3 of their children were there with their families, grandchildren and great-grandchildren running through the grass the way Clara and Austin had once run. The ranch was now in the hands of the 3rd generation, but it still bore the marks of its founders, still operated on the principles of hard work and honest dealing that Clara and Austin had established. During the celebration, Austin stood up slowly, his 78-year-old body not as willing as it once was, and called for quiet. Everyone gathered around, and he reached for Clara's hand, pulling her to her feet beside him. 50 years ago today," Austin said, his voice still strong even if his body was not, "I married my best friend." Clara Zimmerman took a chance on a cowboy who'd been too scared to tell her how he felt for most of his life. "She said yes when I finally got the courage to ask her, and she's been saying yes to me every day since. Yes to building a life together, yes to facing challenges together, yes to raising a family and running a ranch and growing old together." He turned to look at Clara, and the love in his eyes was as clear and bright as it had been on their wedding day. You've been the greatest adventure of my life, Clara Lawrence. Every day with you has been a gift. And if I could go back and do it all again, the only thing I'd change is that I'd kiss you sooner. I'd tell you I loved you the first moment I knew it. I wouldn't waste a single day. Clara was crying openly now, and so were most of the women and more than a few of the men. You made up for lost time, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We've had 50 beautiful years, Austin. 50 years of love and laughter and partnership. And I'd choose you again in a heartbeat. I'd choose you every single time. They kissed then, and their great-grandchildren giggled while their grandchildren smiled and their children wiped away tears. It was a kiss that contained 50 years of history, of love tested and proved, of two people who'd started as playmates and become soulmates. The party lasted until the stars came out, and then Austin and Clara retired to their bedroom, the same room they'd shared for 50 years. They got ready for bed slowly, helping each other with buttons and laces that fingers made clumsy by arthritis struggled with. Then they climbed into bed and Austin pulled Clara close, the way he'd done for thousands of nights, and she rested her head on his shoulder, the place that seemed made for her. "Thank you," Austin whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Clara asked. "For saying yes. For being brave when I was scared. For being my partner in all of this. For giving me the most amazing life I could have imagined." "It was my privilege," Clara said softly. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done, Austin Lawrence, from the first moment to this one." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, and if their breathing was a little more labored than it used to be, if their bodies were worn from decades of hard work and full living, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were together, the way they'd been for their entire lives, the way they'd be for whatever time remained. Austin passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, on a spring morning when the aspens were just beginning to bud. Clara woke to find him still beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers even in death. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe, but underneath it was gratitude. Gratitude that she'd had him for so long, that they'd built such a beautiful life together, that he'd gone peacefully with her beside him. She lived for 3 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the living legacy of the love she and Austin had shared. She told stories about him constantly, keeping his memory alive, making sure the younger generations knew about the man who'd built the ranch and the life that sustained them all. On a warm autumn evening in 1940, Clara sat on the porch watching the sunset and felt a presence beside her. She knew without turning that it was Austin come to bring her home. She wasn't frightened. She was ready. "Took you long enough," she said to the empty air, smiling. "I've been waiting." That night, Clara Lawrence passed away in her sleep, 81 years old and surrounded by the family she and Austin had created. At her funeral, her children and grandchildren told the story of her life, of the ranch girl who'd married her best friend and built an empire. They talked about her strength and her kindness, her fierce love for her family, her partnership with Austin that had been the foundation of everything. They buried her beside Austin in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land they'd loved for eternity. On the shared headstone, their children had carved a simple inscription: Austin and Clara Lawrence, best friends, partners, true loves. Together forever. The ranch continued for generations, the Lawrence Zimmerman legacy living on through the descendants of that cowboy and the girl he'd loved his whole life. And sometimes on quiet autumn evenings, ranch hands swore they could see 2 figures riding across the prairie, side by side, their laughter carrying on the wind. Some said it was just tricks of the light, but those who'd known Austin and Clara smiled and knew better. Some loves were too strong to be contained by something as simple as death. Some loves lasted forever,